Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Best Day Ever, episode number 16. Hope you guys are having a great Monday, and Adam's back joining us. He's back from moose hunting.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's been a long week filled with a lot of fun, but happy to be back here on the show.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to have you back. There's a lot of news stories I want to jump into. I guess first things first, though, how'd the moose hunting go?
Yeah, it was excellent. We didn't get anything, but it was a fun-filled week and lots of family and friend time, as well as some good exercise doing some of those punches. So I was climbing several, I'd call them mountains. They're kind of, if you're in Europe, maybe they're not real mountains, but climbing some serious mountains and punching through the snow and rain. So yeah, tons of fun was had.
Nice. Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have you back because it's a lot harder to, I think, have nuanced conversations and explore all these ideas by oneself. So glad to have a co-pilot here. And essentially just to outline today's stories, because there's a lot of things I want to cover. We're going to be touching upon what's going on with Ukraine, looking at the actual cost there. And I'm excited to get your thoughts and opinions on that, Adam. As well, this week, the Bank of Canada will be meeting on Wednesday, if memory serves me correctly. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out because presumably we'll see another set of rate hikes. We've got the NDP talking about the Emergencies Act. I'm no fan of Jagmeet Singh, but the more often he talks, the less of a fan of his I become. It's literally, there's a correlation there, I believe. Then we've also got Fauci's claims that he had nothing to do with school closures. We're going to fact check him on that. I've got a couple WTF stories for you guys. The second one's a real doozy. I don't know if you looked at it yet, Adam, but I'm excited to chat about that one. And then our main stories of the day, we're going to be talking about the Liberals here in Canada announcing their handgun freeze. I feel like that's a lot of virtue signaling. We've got China's Congress ends as dictator for life with Xi. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. I'm definitely no expert when it comes to the CCP or China's government, but I do think it behooves all of us to at least pay a little bit of attention to what's going on. Then we're going to get into visualizing 20 years of the top trends on Google searches. This is kind of the light. That's the light story of the day. I hope we can have some fun with that one. And then finally, story number 4 will be Ottawa's pandemic hiring boom. We hired a lot of new civil servants over the last 2 years, and it's going to eventually show in our taxes, I think. But anyways, before we jump into all of that, I've got a quick little daily recommendation for you guys that I wanted to share. I don't know if you've got anything, Adam. Oh, I forgot to share my screen again. These are bad habits from last week I got into, but let's pull up the screen share. I'm really excited because Martyr Made just dropped for free to everyone a new podcast. This is part 3 in the... Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, though. This is part 3 in the Jeffrey Epstein series he's been doing. Absolutely fascinating. Highly recommend you guys check it out. This is one of those things where like I actually savor it. So when I really love a book, it honestly usually takes me longer to finish the last chapter of the book than it did to read all the previous parts of that book. And this is kind of me with Martyr Made podcast as well. So over the weekend, he shared this with us for free. I've been holding off, but I'm definitely going to jump into it this week. But spoiler alert, without even listening to it, I already know it's a banger because of everything else Daryl Cooper does with the Martyr Made podcast. How about you, Adam? Any recommendations you want to share?
I hadn't really thought of it, but when I was driving home from the moose hunt, I had obviously a huge drive. It was like 6 hours of driving. And one of the podcasts that I found particularly gripping, maybe not for everybody, but was a Joe Rogan Experience episode with Ryan Graves. And Ryan Graves is a fighter pilot, essentially. Like I think he used to fly jets. I'm not sure if he's still part of the Navy, but wow. I mean, they're talking about unidentified flying objects, which are now labeled something else now, UHPs or some other thing. But there is some serious questions to be answered about some of the aerial phenomenon that they're observing through both their instruments as well as their eyes and their personal experiences. And if nothing else, it's an extremely fascinating exploration of some of the data points that they have, as well as just his personal experiences and the experiences of others on his flight team. So definitely fascinating discussion. And if not extraterrestrial, it's certainly complicated. And I don't know where I stand on that. But at the same time, if you listen to that discussion, and hear some of the data points they have, I think you'll be fascinated. So definitely a great listen.
Yeah, it like this is probably a conversation for another day, but when it comes to UFOs and everything kind of under the sun in regards to that, it's difficult for me to believe that there's extraterrestrial visitors that come here that it's not widely known. But once you start to like get into the minutia of things, like I also get into like questions of like, well, what if they're intradimensional instead of like extraterrestrial? And where do
Yeah.
you kind of like find that delineating point between those different things? But sounds like an interesting podcast for sure. All right, jumping over, I want to get started with a couple story updates with you guys. So, this first one here is all to do with the Ukraine conflict, and I just found it a useful visualization in regards to support of Ukraine right now. So, where most aid to Ukraine comes from, this is courtesy of Zero Hedge. The United States has pledged more than 52 billion euros in military, financial, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine since the war began in February 2022 and October 3rd. Now, that's a decent sum of money. Recently, I think it was actually just today, it came out after this article was originally posted by Zero Hedge, but I think we just saw the EU Parliament announced that they're also going to be funding Ukraine starting in 2023, 1.5 billion euros every single month for as long as the conflict occurs, because they've estimated that just to cover the basic necessities of life and operations in that country, that they're going to be looking at about 3 to 4 billion euros per month, if memory serves me correctly. So let's jump in and look at the actual different contributions from various governments. And what I really appreciate here about this little graphic from Statsta is not only the fact that we've got like the total spending, so we can see like by a country mile, the USA is leading the charge when it comes to financial, military, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But we've also got it as a percentage of each country's GDP. Now, at first brush, maybe point 0.2 when it comes to GDP doesn't sound significant, but like let's actually think about that. Here in Canada, right? We can see here's Canada. We've donated billions of dollars at this point in time, or committed to billions of dollars, but it only amounts to point 0.2 as a percentage of our GDP. Face value, maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal to you guys, but when I think about every $100 generated in our economy here in Canada and 20 cents going towards Ukraine, that actually kind of sounds like a big deal. We previously covered it on Friday, Adam, when you were gone, how the new dental plan that's being implemented by the Liberals and the NDP actually is only going to cost about 700 million, whereas Canada's already contributed over $1 billion this year to the Ukraine conflict. So, what are your thoughts on 0.2% of GDP in Canada being spent on supporting Ukraine?
Well, I just very quickly Googled 2021 GDP of Canada, which was at an all-time high at this is like a really impossible number, but 1,990 billion. So when I think of 0.2% of that, like that's actually going to be an extremely large number. And I think for me, what's most fascinating here by looking at the actual visualization of that is just the concept that like, okay, so if we're doing 0.2, but so is the US, right? So like we find it equally as motivating as the US does. And then perhaps what's maybe more surprising is the support coming from some of the other countries that are no doubt getting extremely affected by the conflict that's going on there right now. And like what I'm interested to hear is like, how do you actually negotiate or how do you de-escalate something like this in Europe when the people that are actually the victims or being affected by this as the citizens of these countries, like when you've got the UK contributing 0.2 as well, like they're going to be suffering this winter, right? They have gas shortages, electrical shortages, massive cost increases. So it's like how do they de-escalate this when all these countries are contributing to their own pain?
Well, and one to build upon that thought there, one thought that I've been kind of thinking about is, right now, Ukraine's not a member of NATO. So, like, is there a line in the sand to how much we would contribute, right? If let's say Ukraine was part of NATO or a Poland got invaded or the UK itself got invaded, would we
Yeah.
go as high as 1% of GDP? Would we go to 10% of GDP? Like, where does that line in the sand stand? Or would we spend any amount necessary in order to support that direct ally? And I don't have an answer here. I'm not even sure if I've got a hard opinion on the subject matter because I do believe it's very nuanced, but it is just interesting to think how much of the global economy is slowly being siphoned off to Ukraine, whether that's for the net benefit of humanity or the net negative of humanity. I think only posterity and hindsight will dictate to us how we view that. But this is definitely worth being aware of, in my opinion.
Well, how about this, Matt? As a Canadian taxpayer who happens to pay a shitload of taxes, I would be interested in seeing the receipts. Where is this going? Right? If we're going to be spending this money from Canadian tax dollars, where is it going? What is it funding? Specifically, what programs, projects, and outcomes are we looking for, and what's the finish line?
And I think one of the difficult things whenever we actually try and dig into these details is often there's an initial budget, then it'll be proposed, right? It'll maybe be approved, but oftentimes that just scopes out what their intentions are. Whereas where the actual money drifts towards is often a different story completely. But, anyways, let's keep rolling here. The second story update I want to share with you guys: Bank of Canada expected to raise interest rates as recession fears grow. This is courtesy of canoe.com. Would be sixth consecutive time interest rates hiked this year in response to decades high inflation. So, quick reminder here: Ottawa, even as warnings about potential recession grow louder, the Bank of Canada is expected to announce another hefty interest rate hike on Wednesday, edging the bank closer to the end. To the end of one of the fastest monetary policy tightening cycles in history. Further on in the article, just for perspective, they share with us since March, the Bank of Canada has raised its key interest rate from 0.25 to 3.25%, feeding into higher borrowing costs for Canadians and businesses. Now, right now, I think the general consensus is we're more likely to see a 0.5 or a 0.75, but a lot of different pundits are putting anywhere from 0.25 to a 0.75 on the table in regards to the Bank of Canada's interest rates hike. And second, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, Adam. But I want to highlight here that this is unprecedented, like in my living memory, at least. And for a lot of Canadians, this is far outside of our comfort zone and our experience zone. So, quick predictions, Adam, on what you think we'll see on Wednesday.
Yeah, I was quickly just catching up. Obviously, I was disconnected for the week, but I also noticed too that they raised payroll taxes. So at like the same time as increasing some of these rates, they're also increasing other
Well,
hidden costs to employers. So yes,
the
Matt.
the powers that be told us that that's technically not a tax, even though it really is a tax when you look into it. It was wild to hear that come out of the Liberal caucus, that essentially you can't look at payroll taxes as a tax on
How
people,
how could that not be a tax on people?
because their argument was it was paying into a program.
Oh,
But that's
fuck off!
literally
It's all
everything that
downstream.
taxes do. All
It's
taxes is
all.
supposed to do is pay into programs and different spending initiatives by the government.
Oh,
It's such a bizarre, backwards logic that they use there. I'm pretty sure several fact checkers jumped on it and said, well, we understand what the government was saying, but they probably were wrong on this one.
that's completely mental. But yeah, Matt, if I had to predict, like just based on some of the stuff I was looking into, like I would go on the higher end. I would go 0.75 and if they dared to, maybe higher, but probably 0.75, which is going to be painful, I think, for the average Canadian.
Yeah, I personally think we'll see between zero point 0.5 and 0.75. I suspect it'll be 0.75. I think the bigger question here, I'd be shocked if it was 1%. I think that would send ripples through the financial world at this moment in time, particularly when we saw Liz Truss essentially being forced out of the UK, right? That's a story we covered last week in
Yeah.
regards to some of her proposed austerity measures when it comes to the British budget. Um, and I don't think that Trudeau or the powers that be in Canada want to see an election called because the bond or equity markets essentially force them to capitulate based upon how those financial markets respond to the interest rates. But the bigger question here, in my opinion, is what comes next, right? So uh, a lot of major talking heads in Canada and economists are stating that come January, we think that that'll be the end, right? So maybe there'll be one more raise after this. A lot of people that are saying there'll be a raise after this think that raise will be smaller, likely in the 0.25 to zero point 0.5 range, particularly if we see a 0.75 here. A lot of pundits that I followed had said they thought Canada maybe will end up at 4.5 and the US at 4.75 in regards to interest rate hikes. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball that works, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But any hot takes there, Adam? Do you think will this be the end of the rate cycle hikes? Do you think we'll see a lot more to come?
Yeah, I could see two more increases by the end of the year. So, I think understanding what the next one looks like probably gives us more information on what the final one would be. But
Yeah, and just for those
yeah,
keeping score at home, I think there would only be one more opportunity for a rate hike this year after October's meeting.
yes,
And
sorry, that's what I mean. So, like the subsequent one,
right,
I think we need to see that what they do on this one first. Like, if they do 0.75 and just like the whole world panics, I wouldn't be shocked if they try and go a little bit less after that. But yeah,
yeah, and
scary.
one of the arguments a lot of mainstream economists are making right now is that we'll see it top in January. That'll be the highest it is. I personally was sharing this on the live video I was on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. EST with the Canadian Real Estate Channel. I personally think we'll see a couple more throughout 2021 or 2021. Geez, 20. What year is it? 2023. And the reason I think that that'll likely be the case is I think if the markets start to sense that there's a softening in monetary policy, if they start to think that the feds are no longer managed by hawks, but instead doves, I think that we could see them starting to get into some wonky pricing in regards to financial markets. And I think that we'll see regulators want to keep things like, no, we're serious, guys. We'll raise an extra 0.25 just to show you how serious we are. But obviously, we'll see how that plays out with time. The next story update I want to share with you, this one, I think the headline's technically a little bit more bombastic than the meat of the subject matter, but either way you slice or dice it, I'm not happy with Jagmeet Singh. This is from CTV News. NDP unlikely to pull support for Liberals if Commission concludes use of Emergencies Act was unjustified. And this was in relation to an interview that Singh gave. So NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says it is unlikely that his party would support for the Liberals if the Public Order Emergencies Commission, examining the federal government's invocation of the Emergencies Act, concludes that doing so was not justified. This is a direct quote from CTV's question period. Simply because it was the wrong decision wouldn't be enough for us to break or to force the country into an election. Now, when framed that way, this actually seems like a relatively reasonable policy prescription or like his perspective on what's going on here. However, I think that Spencer Fernando did a much better job of reframing this. So I just want to share this and then get your thoughts here, Adam. And also, reminder, links to all these stories are in our Telegram chat. So if you haven't joined the Telegram chat, jump over there because we'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions. So we've got comments turned on. Singh is explicitly saying that even if the Liberals are found to have improperly invoked authoritarian emergency powers, which should be a government shattering scandal, he would still keep them in power. And yeah, think about it. If your government essentially enforced, now, they didn't exactly enforce military lockdowns, or we didn't find ourselves in a military coup or anything like that. But we were drifting a lot further on the authoritarian scale than at any other point in my life here in Canada. And I don't think that that should be overlooked, right? Like, if it turns out that Justin Trudeau and his Liberal caucus are judged by the inquiry to have made a mistake in invoking for the first time ever the Emergencies Act here in Canada, that should be a big deal. And while I understand that a lot of Canadians probably are just tired and sick of elections and political discourse in general, I don't necessarily blame you on the surface. This should be something that actually causes a question of whether the Liberals should continue to lead the government. Don't you think, Adam?
Yeah, I would like to think that it's more important to consider the potential future implications of what act like of just setting this precedent. Like, it's never been invoked. So if this guy was allowed to do it and it was a huge mistake, or it was found it's found out that it was done without the necessary amount of due diligence, like, I think that should be that should be capital punishment. Like, that's brutal.
Well,
Because
capital punishment's pretty extreme.
well, I mean, so is locking down your entire country and completely not governing them as a representative of their rights and the things that they believe in and what they voted for, right? Like, if your democracy can at least do that, then we've got serious issues. And, like, at the very minimum, that needs to be an election. And it needs to just be like, okay, is this actually what Canadians stand for? Is this government representing you and your civic rights and in its actions? And I don't think that if it's actually found that this was completely out of line, there's no chance he should remain prime minister. That's so ridiculous. And in fact, I think he would have a duty to personally step down himself. I don't even think there needs to be an election. He just needs to say, okay, we got this wrong. And like, that's it. I've completely destroyed all the trust in our system and our government. And I've laid the path for future endeavors that would look like that. This reminds me of was when Obama was talking about not ever going to use some of the things outlined in the Patriot Act, and it's like, well, then why are they there, right? Like, if you're going to make this act that allows for complete disregard of American citizens' rights, and then you just say you're never going to use them, like, how am I supposed to trust you on that? And then if you ever do use them, it just paves the way to doing it again in the future. And I think that's my biggest concern as a Canadian, is like, if we were allowed to get to this point without any good grounds for it, and that's the precedent, like, what else? What's the next pandemic going to do? What's the next protest going to do? What's the next actual conflict going to do? And that's where I think this is scary.
Yeah. And just to build upon that idea that, in essence, here, it's not just about figuring out whether they were right or wrong in enacting it, but how will we approach the Emergencies Act in the future? We covered this last week, and I'm not sure if you caught the highlights here, Adam, but Brian Peckford's case, right, was essentially officially dismissed. He was the former premier of Newfoundland. And he was one of like the very outspoken critics of vaccine mandates, the vaccine passports, and some lockdown policies and travel restrictions in particular. And we literally saw the judge in that case dismiss it. And the argument was mootness. And what the judge meant by that was, since it's over, it doesn't matter. But where they missed the entire plot, in my opinion, is understanding that no, this is going to dictate how in the future governments respond to pandemics. And you saying that it's moot now because those rules are no longer in effect doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore whether the government was justified in the first place in regards to their invocation of a lot of the more draconian, at least in my opinion, measures we saw come out of the Canadian government.
Yeah.
All right, guys, switching over now. Let's jump into the last story update, and then we'll get into a couple WTF stories. This one is from Fee Stories. Fauci claims he had nothing to do with school closures. His own statements suggest otherwise. So you guys, if you follow the same sort of people on Twitter that I do, you probably already saw some people taking pot shots at Fauci in regards to this. But I think Fee here has done a great job of just going through and trying to document the different instances where maybe Fauci didn't outright state that, like, by decree, you have to follow my words and lock down schools or essentially postpone education. But he, in essence, did that. So first, let's start off what kind of sparked this entire article here. This is a quote from Fauci. I don't want to use the word mistake, John, because if I do, it gets taken out of context that you're asking me the question on. Fauci explained on Sunday. We should realize and have realized that there will be deleterious collateral consequences when you do something like that. Well, first of all, immediately I called the question, why didn't you take that into consideration then if you feel like we should have known that? Because I would argue a lot of people did know that. If we're looking at US politics in particular, I think Rand Paul stands out as a shining example of people that were concerned about the unintended consequences of policies like shutting down schools. Fauci is continuing on from the article here. Fauci is correct that there were serious deleterious consequences of school closures. For example, it was recently reported that the class of 2022 saw average ACT scores plummet to the lowest level in more than 30 years. But let's get into the actual 6 times Fauci argued for school closures. This first one from March 12th, 2020. The direct quote from Fauci, the one thing I do advise, and I said this in multiple hearings and multiple briefings, that right now we have to start implementing both containment and mitigation. And what was done when you close the schools is mitigation. Kind of feels like that's a call to close schools. And now what Fauci's going to naturally always fall back upon is the argument that, well, at the end of the day, it's the CDC's decision. But when you're constantly on the news hyping up the hysteria around COVID policies, right? I kind of argue that you may not be able to mandate it, but you're, for all intents and purposes, attempting to do so in the public discourse. Next, from April 12th, 2020, de Blasio said he spoke to Dr. Fauci last night, who agreed with his decision to keep the schools closed. Here's who I'm thinking about today. New York City's 114,000 homeless students and 200,000 students with disabilities and the 750,000 students who are low income. So again, he maybe in this case didn't call for it, but he said it was the right decision to make. That still kind of feels like you were arguing for school closures. Another April 13th. Fauci slams Ron DeSantis after the Florida governor announced he wants to get schools open as soon as possible. Direct quote here: if you have a situation where you don't have a real good control over an outbreak and you allow children together, they will likely get infected, Fauci said. Again, you can go further into this if you want, guys. Linked to this fee.org article in the Telegram chat. Now, from May 12th, 2020, Fauci dismissed the idea that schools should be opened back up fully because we don't know everything about the virus. CNBC reports Fauci then turned Paul's, this is in regards to Rand Paul, Paul's own phrasing on him. You use the word, we should be humble about what we don't know. I think that falls under the fact that we don't know everything about the virus. And we really had better be very careful, particularly when it comes to children, Fauci said, because the more and more we learn, we're seeing things about this virus can do that we didn't see from the studies in China or in Europe. For example, right now, children presenting with COVID-19 who actually have a very strange inflammatory syndrome, very likely to Kawasaki syndrome, Fauci said. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. But again, this argument is a reoccurring narrative that we've seen time and time again in regards to the COVID hysteria, and that's better safe than sorry. Well, really, at what point in time do we truly know everything about a virus, right? Will we ever know where this virus originally came from? Did it come from, natural bats in China, or did it come from a Wuhan lab studying virology where essentially they were doing gain of function studies? I won't get into all that again. But for literally Fauci to say, because we don't know everything, we shouldn't be opening up schools, that sounds to me like an argument to keep schools closed indefinitely at this point in time. And it's so frustrating that Dr. Fauci seems to think that people don't keep receipts, that somehow when he speaks, there's not recordings and there's not video evidence, and the reporters didn't report what he was originally saying. Again, it just goes on and on at this point in time. Here's another quote from Fauci on schools from the April 8th, or I guess this one would be August 4th. I think they mixed up their dates there. There may be some areas where the levels of virus is so high that it would not be prudent to bring children back to school. In clip, he endorses Zoom education and school closures in areas with COVID transmission. Fauci has never been for full reopening. Again, understand, we still have transmission to this day. So if your argument is we can't open up schools until transmission's completely negated, well, you would be arguing that we should still not have schools open. I just literally, this is like the AIDS epidemic with Fauci all over again. And those of you that haven't dug deep into that, it's worth exploring even just surface level to get an understanding here of the hubris that our top doctor, or at least the American top doctor, has made time and time again in regards to pandemics, epidemics, and just any sort of general threats to the health of the country. Another quote here: I didn't recommend locking anything down. Okay, so now we're going on further on. Why is he saying he did not encourage, suggest, and recommend lockdown and school closures? Asked Vinay Prasad, a professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. Certainly, he didn't make the call by himself, but he used the weight of his reputation in science to advocate these policies. And that's the big point here, right? If for all intents and purposes, you're enforcing these policies on the country by essentially positioning everyone that disagrees with you as being anti-science, as being anti-vaxxer, that and the other, think what Justin Trudeau regularly says about any of his opponents. It's really easy to want to jump to conclusions here and say, Fauci, for all intents and purposes, you did push for school closures. You did everything you could to push for school closures. You should be held responsible for the consequences of those decisions. But here at the end of the fee.org article, this is the real key. Fauci's claims are almost too hard to believe, but they call to mind a piece of wisdom from economist Thomas Sowell. It is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong, Sowell once observed. The pandemic shows just how right Sowell was. Like, I literally get goosebumps when I read that out loud, because that seems to be the entire history of politics here in the West, right? Look at Justin Trudeau. There will be no consequences to any of the scandals he's had in the past, right? Like the Aga Khan, like the We Charity scandal, like, again, we've got a whole list of them that we can go into, or like his pandemic responses, or even like we saw with the judge arguing for mootness in regards to the vaccine passports. When there's no consequences to these individuals making decisions, they do not take it seriously. And that's my biggest complaint right now about the public sector in general, is that they truly, whether rightly or wrongly, infer that there will be no consequences to their policy decisions. And so because of that, we've got people like Jagmeet Singh that say some crazy bombastic shit and feels very comfortable with it, right? We've got Justin Trudeau, who feels very comfortable demonizing any and all political opponents of his. Anything that you want to mention here, Adam?
Yeah, I think in a free market, like a real true free market, there's no way you could run a system like this where your actions didn't have consequences. And I think that's my biggest issue with all of this, is just the complete and utter freedom to make these types of mistakes on a scale this large. Like, Dr. Fauci there, for all of his indirect statements, absolutely used his power, his influence, his station in order to make sure that those rules stayed in place. And I guess for me, um, the real issue comes down to like how bad the negative effects actually were, right? Like I've already brought up on the show, EQAO scores are way down, which means your math, your literacy, your reading, your communications, your speech of all of your children that are in schools right now are all down, right? On average across the board. And it's like, what like untold future consequences of something like that is there? Like, that is so bad for the country, for all of its citizens, for everybody's family unit. Like, that is literally the worst thing you could do to children, is to remove their ability to communicate and to have basic life skills, which revolve around some of those fundamentals, right? Like math and English. There's a reason why we teach these things everywhere around the world. And if we see a full degradation of that, and that's just talking about children, right? We see a full degradation of that. Never mind the economic impacts. Never mind the social impacts on things like depression and everything else by not being able to be there. Like, it is unbelievable how far this ripple will go. It feels more like a tsunami to me than a ripple. And so to not have any consequences to that type of decision making, it seems really honestly quite absurd to me.
Yeah, 100% agree. And unfortunately, I also just feel like it's going to be par for the course for the foreseeable future. I know more extreme voices on social media and stuff are calling for like Nuremberg 2.0 trials, right? And things of that nature. I just understand that the only reason the Nazis were held to account for some of the atrocities that they inflicted during World War II was because of the complete and total warfare enacted by both sides, with essentially like the German state being destroyed, right? And not completely rebuilt from the ground up, but in essence being built up from the ground up in regards to, even splitting Berlin into four different sectors, right? And splitting Germany into multiple political entities. We're not, in my humble opinion, barring complete revolution, we're not going to see that play out here in the West. And so I don't know where that leaves us, right? I think that politicians and public health administrators and officials are so pot committed that they can never admit mistake at this moment in time for fear of actually having consequences come down, right, for them. And the general population, like, I don't like, maybe some of us want true revolution, but the vast majority of people don't want that sort of disruptive experience, right? And so it really does feel like we're in between a rock and a hard place at this moment in time in regards to how do we move forward? What comes next here? And I think, unfortunately, we're going to end up just kicking the can down the road until there's a more extreme version of what we've currently experienced. And then at that point in time, it maybe will boil over into more revolutionary sort of talk from the average person. But anyways, I just it's interesting to see history literally being rewritten in front of us, particularly in this case in regards to Dr. Fauci and his claims. But let's jump into some other news stories. These are some WTF stories. First things first, I don't know if we've talked about Ethan Klein before, Adam. Do you know who he is or the H3H3 podcast?
No, honestly, I've never heard of this person before.
So big YouTuber, been around for a long time. I never was a huge consumer of his content, but I watched it, maybe like 5, 6 years ago when I was originally getting into YouTube. A buddy of mine, Adam Steeper, used to follow him, and I think originally put me onto him. Ethan has really evolved as a content creator, and in my perspective, not necessarily a good thing. We covered this briefly last week, so I won't beat this dead horse too much, but YouTube suspends H3 for Holocaust joke. Host Ethan Klein reacts on Twitter. So we covered the original Holocaust joke he made in regards to Ben Shapiro. And I said at the time, I was shocked he wasn't banned from YouTube. Subsequently, YouTube did end up suspending him for 7 days. But the one thing I want to highlight here is Ethan truly believes, or at least seems to be sticking to his guns, he did nothing wrong in regards to referring to his hope that if there is a second genocide in regards, or a second Holocaust, I should say, in regards to Jewish people. And I understand Ben Shapiro and both Ethan Klein have Jewish ancestry. That he hopes Ben Shapiro is the first to go, which is pretty extreme in my opinion, right? And in this
Although
day
that's
of
kind of funny if it's
it,
a joke.
is it though? Like, I don't think it is. Like, to literally, I don't know. But anyways, let's look at what he responded to on Twitter in regards to his 7-day suspension. A few white supremacists successfully lobbied YouTube to suspend me, a Jewish dual citizen of Israel and USA, for anti-Semitism, said Klein, announcing his YouTube suspension Thursday evening. Ben Shapiro and friends can virtue signal all they want, but ultimately they are the ones platforming dangerous anti-Semites. All I did was point it out. Now, there's something particularly ironic about him claiming Ben Shapiro, who's actively Jewish, who often supports a lot of the Jewish state, right? Israel's policies and positioning, and Ethan Klein, who's often a critic of them, for him to claim that Ben Shapiro is essentially an Uncle Tom for the Jewish state, right? Or for white supremacists in regards to the Jewish state, I should specify there. It's so bizarre to me. And honestly, he goes on to continue to try and justify himself and says that Ben Shapiro is just a puppet of right-wing anti-Semites and things of that nature. It just, we don't have to spend a lot of time here, but at this moment in time, like public discourse is just so bizarre. Where literally up is down and left is right, that I have to point out some weird WTF stories. Because I think if the roles were reversed, if this was a non-Jewish person making this joke about Ethan Klein, I think that we would see far more backlash on social media and outcries. And it feels like a double standard there in regards to how social media platforms often enforce these things. But to think that white supremacists, anti-Semites, are going to be upset by a Jewish Holocaust joke just doesn't pass the sniff test, in my opinion. But anyways, let's move on to the second story of the second WTF story of the day. This one's a doozy. Not sure if you checked it out in advance, Adam, but it's so bizarre, and I've got questions. But anyways, influencer spends $11,000 for plastic surgery to look like boyfriend's sex doll because that's the world we live in. This is courtesy of Louder with Crowder. I guess first, is it literally cheaper to get plastic surgery to look like a sex doll than to get a sex doll that looks like you?
Holy shit. So I actually I read this story yesterday. I read the headline to this story yesterday, but I thought it was reversed. I thought she bought an $11,000 sex doll. But if
That would
it's the
actually
other
make
way
more
around,
sense.
yeah, I
Again,
thought that's what it was.
but no, she literally got plastic surgery to look like. What if her boyfriend decides he wants a different sex doll? Is she just going to be chasing this now and upgrade and mutilate herself, in my opinion, in regards to looking more like the sex doll? And here's a photo of her with said sex doll. I just like, it is so bizarre. I would guess that $11,000 in plastic surgery, I hope, is less than the sex doll. But again, I'm not up to date on the prices of sex doll. Can you fill us in, Adam?
No, I wouldn't have a clue, but I would have thought she would have started with her breasts first because it doesn't look like she was up to par with those just based on that one photo there. So I don't know. That's crazy, but I mean, this girl does have some discretionary income, so I don't know. Maybe he's motivated for other reasons, Matt.
Just bizarre to say the least. I don't know if you followed Whitney Cummings, Adam, but she's like a comedian, right? And one of her stand-ups, she got like a life-size sex doll made of herself, right? And brought it up on one of her comedy specials. I think that one was even more expensive, but because, like, if I remember correctly, like, didn't it move or sort of
It
talk a bit?
moves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it like moves and talks, which is crazy.
So, like, if I remember correctly, I want to say she spent like 30 or 40,000 on it. But anyways, just bizarre to say the least. And I'm going to choose to find the humor in this because otherwise I'm going to get very black pilled on the state of society. All right, moving on. I already shared with you guys my recommendation for the day, so let's jump over to the first story of the day. This is courtesy of Spencer Fernando. Liberals announce handgun freeze on legal gun owners as their soft on crime policies make Canada more dangerous. So just quickly, in case you missed it, this was announced by Justin Trudeau on Twitter a day after audio release showing RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki seemed to be trying to push the Liberal agenda on gun policy. The Liberals have implemented their handgun freeze on law-abiding gun owners. Here's what Justin Trudeau said on Twitter. Update, people can no longer buy, sell, or transfer handguns within Canada, and they cannot bring newly acquired handguns into the country. And obviously, like a lot of critics of this policy, my first question is simply, oh, so criminals are going to follow this law, but not any other law that we've ever implemented here? I don't, sorry?
Matt, listen. Here's the thing: when you're going to bring up those other laws, I feel like I have a duty here to inform people. As a restricted firearms license holder myself here in Canada, I have to follow certain rules for what's called an authorization to transport. So this means that as a law-abiding citizen, I can only bring my restricted firearms directly from my house to the firearms range with no additional stops, diversions, anything. If you need fuel, you're breaking the law. If you need to pick up a friend that's going with you to the range, you're breaking the law. If you need to, for whatever reason, protect yourself and somehow that gun is involved, you are absolutely breaking the law. There is no way in Canada to use that restricted firearm, which pistols all fall into that class unless they're prohibited because they've got a smaller barrel, in which case you already can't have those. There is literally no reason or way that you could transport that firearm from the safety of your gun safe in your house to anywhere else other than the range. Okay. And even when you're doing that in transport, it must be locked, ammunition kept separate. So these are the existing rules. Okay. So if you're doing anything outside of that, you are already falling under the class in their eyes of a criminal. So like this type of law preventing the sale, the transfer, or the purchase of these firearms is so asinine that it's unbelievable. And all that it does, in my opinion, is bring upon prohibition, which has never worked. The war on drugs did not work. The war on terror has not worked. The war on guns is not going to work, because what ends up happening here is as people that own these firearms get older and they're, on their deathbed, and there's a rule that, okay, they need to submit their guns upon their death to be destroyed, right? Or follow some sort of buyback program. Like, where do you think these guns are going to go? Do you think, grandpa who's on his deathbed gives a shit about the rules? And he's the law-abiding guy, right? Potentially. No, he's going to give it to his friends, his family, his whatever. He's not going to see that thing go. And that's just one way I can see guns entering the market. There's going to be also a bunch of disgruntled people that have invested tens of thousands of dollars into their firearms collection that now don't have an answer for that. And so, this is such an absurd way to think that crime is going to be reduced. And as just one example of this, I'd like to turn your attention to the gun crime. If you guys want to just do a quick Google search, research gun crime in New York City, and then research gun laws in New York City. It is nearly impossible to get a firearms license in New York City. It's literally almost impossible. And let alone have something like a concealed carry or some version of a license that would allow you to have a pistol. It is so fucking hard to get these. And their gun crime is absurd. They have thousands. If you just Google this quick, they have thousands and thousands of arrests for gun crimes, and they have hundreds of murders every year conducted by guns. Your laws don't stop this type of thing. Criminals don't care about the rules that you place on them. They're just going to buy guns that are not traced to them legally through whatever means they have from other criminals. They can steal them from break and enters, whatever, right? This is not going to help anything. It's crazy. And I think that all it does is piss off your legal gun owners, and then they'll start doing interesting behavior as well. So I don't know. This is criminal.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of those sentiments. I think one of the common criticisms of gun-free zones you'll hear about from particularly U.S. citizens is this idea that it just makes for a ripe opportunity for criminals with guns, right? If I know I can go into that school zone, if I know I can enter the mall, and no one else, sometimes even including security officers, have guns, it only incentivizes me to want to get a gun as a bad actor. And it's so frustrating at this moment in time to see this being implemented, because I can't help but feel like, again, Justin Trudeau has this avatar of who he believes to be his enemy. And honestly, I think that it's rural individuals, a lot of Western individuals, it's people with guns, it's people that want bodily autonomy, it's people that want to be left alone. And he believes that these are the misogynists, the racists, the bad actors, the anti vaxxers, the anti science, and every other sort of bad word he thinks he can lobby at them. And so he's trying to punish them, because it's not honestly about trying to tighten our laws around bad actors with guns. And that leads me into the second story. You mentioned, Adam, that guns will find a way into this country. 100%. And they'll find their way by even toboggan, which leads us to the Toronto Sun story here. Man out of jail year after conviction for smuggling 248 guns into Canada. So you can smuggle 248 illegal guns into Canada and get 1 year of jail time and the rest on parole. But let's cover the facts of the story first, and then we can share our opinions. If most Canadians heard that smuggling close to 250 handguns into Canada would see you get day parole after just 1 year, they might be shocked. Yet, that's the case of a man who was convicted of gun smuggling in July 2021. So, again, this case is barely a year old at this moment in time, and this individual is already out on day parole. William Rainville pleaded guilty just over a year ago to bringing in the bodies of 248 polymer 80 Glock type pistols without serial numbers. There were also high capacity magazines and other parts for these illegal weapons. The estimated street value of all the gear was 1.6 million on the black market. Rainville has maintained since the beginning of his trial that he didn't know the hockey bags he carried across the border in the dead night on a toboggan were filled with guns. According to his story, he did this for a friend who owed him money at a time when things weren't going well in his life. It just, like, again, the circumstances of this case do not lend me to give him the benefit of the doubt. If a buddy was like, yo, man, I need a favor from you. I know I owe you a bunch of money. I'll pay you back if you take a toboggan with hockey bags across the border in the middle of the night illegally. I wouldn't be like, yeah, that checks out. I don't imagine there's any real criminal enterprise going on here. And one other point I just want to make is when you make legal gun ownership illegal in Canada, right, particularly around handguns we're talking right now, it only incentivizes criminals to fill that market demand, right? So again, I wouldn't be surprised if some legal gun or like law-abiding gun owners decide that they would still like to continue to collect handguns, even if it's not for a nefarious reason. But now their only option is going to be able to turn to black markets in order to provide or to satisfy that need. Now, you may question in the first place whether that need actually truly exists, but I can't imagine that someone bringing in 1.6 million and illegal black market guns gets a year in jail. Meanwhile, we're essentially going to demonize any law-abiding Canadian. Again, like Adam mentioned, there's a lot of hoops to jump through before you're even going to be allowed, or at least previously, before you were going to be allowed to be able to buy that handgun. It also wasn't going to be cheap, right? It's not like they're just giving away guns. It's like buy one, get one gun free here in Canada. It's just so bizarre. But what are your thoughts on this Toronto Sun story?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this is a very large misconception too with the legal gun owners in Canada. And I know this because I'm friends with lots of them. I go to the range quite often. And my thing is, like, something like this should be punished extraordinarily, right? If you're going to be like bringing seriously illegal shit into the country and smuggling it in for what's clearly a black market purpose, like that type of crime should be punished very heavily. The same with like violent gun crime or any type of like assault with a weapon. I think that those types of charges, I would be fine to see all of those types of charges like go astronomical. Like if you shoot somebody, yeah, it's just life in prison. That's simple. Right. And so you could deter crime with something like that, where somebody knows. Now, of course, it may not actually prevent all crime, which no laws ever will, but you could certainly deter a lot of crime by having really heavy penalties for breaking the rules. But anybody that's going to actually follow the rules, get the criminal background check, get references, get testimony rather from your actual previous spouses and shit. Like you have to jump through serious hoops to get a restricted firearms license, because it's true. They can be used as tools to commit crimes, but so can everything else, right? You see lots of stabbings, you see lots of vehicular manslaughter, you see all this stuff. And you can't ban cars, you can't, like, good luck trying to ban knives. Like, it's just so stupid to think that the tool is responsible for the crime. And that to me is, I think, where it just ends. I mean, increase your actual penalties for violent crime or any type of smuggling and stuff like that that's going to contribute to more criminal activity. But It just seems absurd to try prohibition. Like, it's never worked. It has literally never worked on anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we're going long here, so I'm going to jump into the next story of the day, just so we don't miss out on everything I want to cover with you guys. But I think there's a lot more to dissect, and maybe we'll get in deeper into the subject matter of gun control in Canada in a future episode. But this from Zero Hedge: China Congress ends as dictator for life. Xi stacks inner circle with loyalist equity markets implicated or implications. 1 week after it started with a historic resetting speech by China's president on Sunday, a day after China's top political meeting of the past 5 years wrapped up, Xi Jinping unveiled a new leadership team stacked with loyalists as he looks to consolidate his power in a precedent busting third term. 1 day after his predecessor, Hu Jintao, was unceremoniously escorted out of the 20th Party Congress for reasons still unknown, Xi walked into Beijing's Great Hall of the People, followed by members of the Communist Party New Politburo Standing Committee, the pinnacle of Chinese leadership in descending ranking order. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but just for context, remember, this is someone that our prime minister, or this is a government that our prime minister was directly caught saying that he respects their authoritarian bent because of how quickly they can get shit done. Like, hey, if you've got a political opponent that was your number two, you can just disappear them pretty quick in the CCP, and that's pretty handy if you don't like dissidents. Um, Further on in this article, and again, I'm by no means an expert on the CCP or China's government. I don't think Adam would claim to be either. This article is a great little refresher, though, if you want to sink your teeth into the subject matter. The appointments of Xi's associates to the highest positions of power in China indicate that Xi's vision for China will be rigidly executed in the next decade, said Valerie Tan, an analyst at the Germany-based Mercator Institute for China Studies. Those promoted to power have had their political careers closely tied to Xi's leadership, implying that this is going to be an administration that will not question or challenge Xi's authority. Most notably, Xi will renew his presidency for a third time after he ditched a two-term limit from China's constitution in 2018, opening the door for him to rule for life. And it certainly seems like that's the trajectory right now that China's on, right? With him really filling all the top political positions in China with loyalists to his positions and to his persona. Any quick thoughts here, Adam, on what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I always have real critical questions for anybody that is going to just sort of remove things like that from constitution. And like a lot of these things are echoed by previous governments, right? Like, if you see the USSR and things that like Stalin did, first you install your people and then you kind of just take power. And then all of a sudden, that opens up avenues for more authoritarian measures and things that your political contestants or political adversaries may have questioned before or thought, maybe this is not representative of what the people actually want or need. And so this certainly lays the brickwork for perhaps a dark future for China.
Yeah, I think if anything, one takeaway here is that it's likely going to continue on an authoritarian bent, right? And there's a lot of backdoor politicking when it comes to China and the CCP party. I'm going to jump to our fourth story of the day. If we got time, we'll maybe touch upon the third story, but the fourth story I think is worth exploring here first. Ottawa's pandemic hiring boom adds billions to federal payroll. This is courtesy of CBC News. 35,000 new jobs, 12% growth over 2 years of COVID lockdowns. Just quickly want to highlight this here. Here's a chart breaking down where we were at. You can see Harper, under his administration, we were slowly decreasing the amount of people on the payroll dole, or on the public payroll dole, I should say. Under the Trudeau era, we've seen it increase. And if you actually dive deep into the stats here, over the course of 2015 to the present day, we've seen about a growth of a third in regards to the total number of Canadian public employees. And as well, one little tangent here that I need to make: understand that we're also seeing all-time highs in regards to consultants from the government. So when you really start to slice and dice this, it's even more than a 33% increase during Justin Trudeau's tenure here as prime minister. And there's consequences to these public policies, right? As we were exploring last week in regards to the dental program, like, who's going to pay for all this? Like, we're literally talking about an increase in payroll for the government of billions of dollars with these 35,000 new hires. What are your thoughts here, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just an extraordinary weight for the average Canadian citizen to bear in terms of, because like obviously this is going to come from taxes. And it's like, what programs are these people being added to? Are these things that the average Canadian actually gets any benefit from at all? And I think furthermore, like, how do you, like, traditionally when we think of government employees, you don't really think like, oh, these are easy to hire and fire. It's like, no, they have a lot of rules and regulations and red tape. So like, if you're going to add that many jobs, it's like layoffs are not like an easy option like you might have in the free market. Like, no, these people have benefits. They have actual career paths. They have all this bureaucracy associated to like how they can be hired and fired. And it's just like, this is an incredible weight to bear, and it's probably not going to go away. But I do think it's convenient that you can just print all the money that you need to hire all the people that you need and then pass all of the costs down to the average consumer. So this is just another thing with downstream effects that lead right back to your average family that's, again, right now concerned about prices of gas, prices of hydro, prices of fuel at the gas pumps, in addition to the gas to heat their homes. Like, and their food costs are going up. Education's like not even happening. It's just like, man, wow. And then it's like, okay, let's add a bunch of funding for Ukraine to keep you guys distracted by a conflict in Europe. And it's just like, holy smokes, there's a lot of cost being passed on to the average guy.
And again, I believe, based on my understanding of economics, the government probably kicked that can at least a few more times before the piper finally has to be paid. But understand that each decision we go to go deeper into deficit makes the medicine that we're eventually going to have to take all the more painful. And
Yes.
it, it's so important, I think, in this time of high financial volatility when the markets are all over the place. You need to really be making sure that you're building your own foundation, right? And be building on a foundation of stone rather than a foundation of sand. I think that it's really easy in these unprecedented economic times to want to chase fast, easy, loose money. However, that's not how empires are truly built. That's not how people really position themselves for any sort of financial future. And just want to highlight, guys, that there's no better time than today to really be taking your personal financial journey seriously. In the second half of this show, we're actually going to jump in and explore the first principles thinking around financial independence and how to retire early. I'm looking forward to just kind of having an open conversation here with Adam where we can riff on this subject matter, hopefully highlight some of what we believe to be best practices where you can essentially insulate yourself from the financial volatility that I personally think over the next decade we are very likely to experience. And the one key thing I want to leave you guys with in regards to this is just understand that the less you need, the richer you are. It's a very simple dynamic. It's very easy to nod your head along to that, but understand if you believe that in every fiber of your being, you will be able to navigate volatility unlike any of your peers. But before we jump into the second half of the show, I just really quickly wanted to highlight this because this is the closest thing to a white pill story I've got. But this is from Zero Hedge. Again, link in the Telegram chat if you guys haven't joined it. Go over, join it so that you can get all these links. But visualizing 20 years of top trending Google searches. We don't have time to explore everything, but I just thought, even looking at 2001, this was just filled with nostalgia, in my opinion. Mainly not for Osama bin Laden, but everything else. Whether it's Harry Potter, Britney Spears, Napster, Nokia phones, Windows XP, or Shrek. Um, anything you want to add there, Adam?
Yeah, fun fact, Matt has never consumed Harry Potter, so you can't trust him on anything
Any
else.
of it.
But
Never read a book, never watched a movie. And it all, like, it's silly, but like it's probably something someone should understand about my personality is that, like, when I make a promise to myself about something, I stick to it. And so I think when Harry Potter was popping off, probably around 2001, my girlfriend at the time wasn't like a voracious reader like I was. Like, I was just constantly reading anything and everything I get my hands on. And she was actually like cranking these Harry Potter books. And she was like, this is the best writing ever. I was like, it's probably a good book, but like, let's dial it back here. Best writing ever seems a little extreme, right? Like, you haven't read Tolkien or Asimov or H.G. Wells or like any of like anyone that this was kind of built upon, right? Like all the previous iterations of fantasy and science fiction storytelling. And she consistently insisted that no, it was literally the greatest book of all time. And I was like, give me a page. And I just flipped to a random page and read it. I was like, not the greatest book of all time. I'm never reading this.
Small sample size, but I would have to agree, Matt. It couldn't possibly be the greatest of all time, but it did change the lives of many people.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, not hating on anyone that enjoys Harry Potter, but if you come at me claiming it's the best book of all time, my spite meter will just be 100%.
Well, I hope one day to just ambush Matt with Harry Potter playing at the Citadel, and we'll have to get you guys in the comments. What are some ways I could con Matt into watching the Harry Potter series with me? But yeah, I think, Matt, that pretty much concludes the show. So we're going to just probably take a couple-minute break here, and we'll be right on to BDE number 16. We're already at number 16, which I'm really excited for. We're going to be talking all about financial independence. We'll see you guys in a couple minutes.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day, no matter what the weather say. Life is like a record, so just let it play. Educate, motivate, entertain and demonstrate. Health, wealth, relationships and legacy we elevate. Every day is what you make it, so don't take it and waste it. Never too late to save it. Remember, roses grow from pavement. Let me break this down in layman's. Just wanna live outrageous, build my way to greatness. Gotta speak my truth and face it. Hear the basis lies, gotta challenge it and break it. Take a shot of truth, chase it with some motivation. The best day ever, the best day ever. We gon' squad up, have the best day together. Best day ever, best day ever. We gon' squad up, go hard in any weather. What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day, no matter what the weather say. Life is like a record, so just let it play. Best Day Ever Media. Song by Dan the Lost Boy.
All right, guys, we're back. Monday, part 2 of the BDE episode. We're, again, reminder, every single Monday we jump deep into economics, business, financial independence, anything around those sort of subject matters. It's free game to our second half of the Monday show. But before we even jump into that, I quickly wanted to give a shout out to Al, who's very active in the comment section on YouTube. Really appreciate it. As well, Al, you were the very first Rumble commenter that we had on a video. All last week, Adam, I was kind of complaining about how no one had left us a comment on any of our Rumble videos. I at least saw 2 from Al that week, so I really do appreciate that. And appreciate everyone that's joining us on our journey, I guess, to try and have the best day ever. And that's really what this show is all about. So in today's show, what I want to explore with you guys and Adam is financial independence, retiring early. This is a subject matter really near and dear to my heart. And in particular, we're going to be exploring kind of the first principles thinking that I think is absolutely key when it comes to trying to get control of your financial lives and your financial journey. Now, all this is actually based upon a ebook that I put together, completely free. You guys can go grab it if you are so inclined. I'll do a quick screen share here. And reminder, the second half of these shows, we always post a Substack article that you can check out Monday through Thursday. So really encourage you guys, if you haven't joined Substack, one, it's actually a very simple process. Two, if you want to read the Substack articles without actually even signing up for Substack, spoiler alert, you can actually do that. You just click the let me see it first little link below where it asks you for an email. Although we'd really appreciate if you guys gave us your email. It's one of the ways that we can constantly keep in touch with you. It's one of the reasons that we think it's so important you join both the Telegram chat, where we can interact, just real quick, back and forth. And then secondly, Substack, where we can have longer form conversations. But for anyone that wants to grab the ebook before we get into today's show, you can go to mattmckeever.com/ebooks, and you'll see a list here of all the different ebooks. Now, it's not necessarily the most user-friendly, but hey, this is all free. So if you click it, it should take you back up to the top. You can click read now. For whatever reason, download's not working on it. I need to get a new website, guys. So if you guys know a guy, hit me up. But essentially, if you read now, you can go through the entire PDF. But let's jump over to the Substack article because I want to explore this with you guys real quick before we open it up to the discussion. Let's quickly just define the term financial independence and retiring early. So FIRE. FIRE is described as a concept and movement dedicated to high savings rates and continuous consumption of resources to allow, or conscious consumption of resources to allow an individual to retire before the traditional age range of 55 to 65. FIRE is about taking ownership of your personal situation and personal finances. Think of FIRE as a first principles approach to living your life. And we'll get into what first principles is in a second. But before we do so, I just quickly want to explain my background with FIRE and then open it up to you, Adam, and hear yours as well. But the very first time I think I ever discovered the concept of FIRE, I don't remember the exact day, but I remember the office I was working in. It was at the BDO offices in Mitchell, Ontario. And I would regularly go to the National Post and the Toronto Star, and both the National Post and Toronto Star every now and then would have articles on personal finances, right? How to get control of your personal financial situation. Usually though, it's this couple has $1 million in assets and has no idea how they're ever going to retire. And I always found that very intimidating. And then one day they did an article on, I can't even think of his name right now. I think it was MD, but were his initials, but the guy from $1 Million Journey. And essentially, it was a Canadian blog with this individual documenting their journey to try and get $1 million so they could retire early. Well, I became a huge fan of the $1 Million Journey blog. It introduced me to a bunch of others like Free Money Finance. And eventually, I stumbled upon ERE, the Early Retirement Extreme. And that blog from Jacob Lund-Fisker completely changed my life and changed the trajectory of my life, because before that I knew that I wanted to be rich so I didn't have to work, so I could choose to work, but I didn't really actually understand the intricate details. I'd read Rich Dad Poor Dad and was like, okay, I think real estate plays into this, but at the same time I didn't have the confidence to move forward because I didn't have clarity, because everyone around me told me that real estate investing was a bad idea, that you didn't want to be a landlord. However, none of them themselves were actually landlords. And so as I discovered Early Retirement Extreme and realized that Jacob was really taking a first principles approach to not only investing, but to the entire concept of retiring early or becoming financially independent, that was just mind blown for me. And eventually then afterwards, we would see another entrant, Mr. Money Mustache, and essentially all those different blogs I've mentioned, those were the synthesis for my YouTube channel for all the content that I've created on financial independence. And I'm just so happy I discovered this idea. I really think that it's a huge blemish or black mark on our society as well as on our education system, that the concept of financial independence, that the Trinity study, that a lot of the different factors that play a role in understanding financial independence aren't taught at a young age. Because the only thing I'm mad about is I didn't discover it earlier. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, and what your experiences were, Adam, in regards to discovering the concept of financial independence.
Yeah, my path towards financial independence has been a long and rocky one. And I think it started when I started my first business in high school, like a little landscaping business. And the reason why I did that is because I recognized very quickly that working for an employer meant very specific sets of rules and times where you would have to work, and specific just obligations that I didn't necessarily want. And one of the biggest things that I was interested in was just having control over my time. And so, starting my own little business, it turns out actually took way more time than just showing up 40 hours a week. So that was a bit of a misnomer in terms of, will this give me my time back? It's like, not really. But it actually allowed me to work when I wanted to. So although I probably worked more, I was able to choose those specific times more often than not. And that gave me freedom to do things like, I've just returned from a moose hunt, right? So I could put off some work for a week and then come back to it later. Later, after college, which I incurred a ton of debt, by the way, and did a bit of traveling. And so I'd really spent a lot of money there and accumulated a bunch of debt. And so I got a job sort of to suit my debt level. And so I was making a decent amount of money, but I realized very quickly that I was getting, essentially like overweight and really upset. Like I was just disenfranchised with the whole system of having to go every day to an office, leave my house, fight traffic, sit at the office for 8 to 10 hours, and then drive and fight traffic on the way back home. And then like still not hit targets or something like that. Right. And for me, that was when I had my eyes opened up to kind of exploring some more of the content, like you mentioned. Like one of my first great books I read was The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump. And then I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So I think that's maybe in a bad order, but I read The Art of the Deal first. Then I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Then I read The Wealthy Barber, Dave Chilton, and sort of stumbled actually kind of upon you at that point, right? And that's sort of around the time where we did that limo tour, and then was able to basically ingest your entire YouTube channel in the space of a couple of days, which was wild. And then, that you also turned me on, of course. You gave me a copy of Early Retirement Extreme. And that's sort of how my venture kind of got to here too. And using some of those principles, and I'm sure we'll get into this because I'm probably a great example of some of the things you don't want to do if you're trying to achieve FIRE. It's the early part that's difficult for me. Financially, that led to us sort of building some businesses together and getting a taste of what it's like to increase your income. So if you don't want to decrease your outputs, you can always increase your income. But I think during this discussion, I would love to explore some of the things that I've done wrong, because I've certainly made many mistakes on the way to financial independence.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that'll be a useful kind of exploration here in this segment. And I guess specific to the concept of financial independence, retire early, the second half of that, the retire early, often gets pushback from a lot of pundits, a lot of thought leaders, a lot of mainstream media, where they'll question things like, am I Matt McKeever retired, or my buddy Michael Rosehart, or even Jacob from Early Retirement Extreme, or I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, but Mr. Money Mustache, or Pete, whether Pete's retired. And I think that what they misunderstand about what really FIRE is FIRE is as much a thought process, a way of living, as it is literally like the number of dollars in your bank account. And what I mean by that is I know, like, at least for myself, Matt McKeever, I can scale up or scale down my personal living needs at a flip of a switch. If tomorrow somehow, like, it turns out the government seized all my property, I wouldn't immediately feel like I was hand to mouth, ass to mouth, whatever they call that term, where you're constantly panicking when there's a term, I can't think of it, and those are not the right terms that I use. But like where you're constantly living in debt, right? And you're constantly struggling to get by. What I actually understand is that, like, really, when it comes to my life, there's only a few things you need, right? And I view it kind of through the lens of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the physiological needs are really the needs that I need to meet in regards to like in regards to finance, right? So I need shelter, I need food, I need some basic clothing. But what that stuff costs me can vary dramatically. So yeah, in the past, have I spent $1,000 on a suit? I have. But do I also know that I could literally go down to Value Village or to Lee's or some other place and buy like a $10 worth of clothes and literally have probably enough clothes to last me a month? yeah, I also am very aware that I can scale up or scale down my personal needs as necessary. And that really just lends itself to individual preferences. And so, again, understanding that my preferences shouldn't really dictate how I view my interactions with money or how I view my interactions with the general economy. I think that that's where a lot of people get themselves in this treadmill of constantly chasing the next thing, right? So, the moment that they feel comfortable making their $1,000 a month mortgage payment is the moment they decide to go out and buy a bigger house that's going to cost them $2,000 a month. Now, if you struggle to internally motivate yourself, those external motivating factors can, in theory, be a net benefit because it's going to drive you to push yourself harder, right? It's going to drive you to improve yourself and become a better version in order to be able to make that $2,000 a month mortgage payment. However, I do think that there's a lot of unnecessary stress that oftentimes goes hand in hand with that sort of approach to life versus it's almost like a very minimalist thought process, right? It's a very aesthetic sort of view where it's like, I don't need much. And I understand that like a lot of the things in life that people become chained to are actually like just as much using them as they are using those things. And that to me is why the concept of first principles in particular is so important when we're having this exploration of financial independence. So I'm going to pull up the Substack article here and dive a little bit deeper into what I mean by first principles. So, first principles is a foundational proposition or assumption that stands alone and cannot be deduced from any other proportion or proposition or assumption. So, what we mean there is like throw out everything you've been told about finances. So, you've probably been told, if you work really hard, if you save 10% of your income, if you constantly work for that promotion, you might be able to retire by 55 or at least by 65. Well, again, if you use that as your basis, you might consider early retirement retiring at 52 or 50 years of age. And I'm not throwing shade at anyone that chooses to retire at 50 or 52, but I am throwing shade at the individuals that can't retire until they're 65. The people that don't feel like they're in control of their personal finances. And a lot of the reason you don't feel like you're in control of your personal finances is in fact because you don't control your financial expenditures, right? Money in, money out, the net is your savings. It's actually a very simple, basic proposition and concept, but the vast majority of humanity, particularly in the Western world, struggle with internalizing this. So when we're talking about how to achieve fire, really what we know if we're starting from a first principles thinking is we need to determine our needs, right? So again, circling back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what do I need from a physiological perspective? Well, I need shelter, I need clothing, I need some food. Outside of that, I don't really need much. But a lot of people are going to think, well, I need as nice of a house or nicer house than my brother-in-law has, right? I need a nicer car than my parents have. I need this, that, I need, and the other. When really that's not the case. And now we won't get deep into it in this segment, but for those of you interested, I really encourage you go look at the Trinity study, or at least look at the ebook I shared with you in the Trinity study. They'll explain why saving 300 times your monthly expenses is likely the target you should be aiming for if you want a very passive approach to financial independence, and essentially you just want to buy a portfolio of bonds and stocks or equities. Or we can look at developing passive income that covers our monthly expenses. This to me is what's so attractive about real estate investing, about small businesses, side hustles, things of that nature. And then literally step 3 is you reach fire, you can drop mic and retire. But when actually exploring the 3 steps for first principles thinking, identify and define your current assumptions, break down the problem into its foundational principles, create new solutions from scratch. So if we think about the lens of like having enough, right? Having enough money to be able to survive indefinitely, well, that means we have enough money or enough income to be able to acquire the things we need in order to survive indefinitely. And that's where, again, shelter, food, clothing, transportation come into play. But as we mentioned previously, what you spend on those expense categories can vary dramatically, right? Some people will spend literally $100 or less on transportation a month with an expensive bus pass or a metro pass. Other people might spend $1,000 a month just on their car payment, let alone the insurance, the fuel to do that, the maintenance, the upgrades, the whatevers in regards to their vehicle. Well, those two people are going to reach a level of financial independence at very different expense categories if they're going to stick with that. Oh, looks like I lost Adam. But we're going to keep rolling here regardless. So here's an example of a first principles approach to fire. And again, you can grab this in the free e-guide. But step 1, current assumptions. It takes decades to be able to save for retirement, and you need millions of dollars to be able to retire comfortably. I think this is a very mainstream proposition these days, particularly with inflation, at all-time highs, at least in my living memory. However, specific to this, we need to really break down those assumptions and question whether they're accurate into us being able to navigate our financial futures. So step 2, break down problem. To retire, I need enough passive income or savings to cover my needs and allow me to live indefinitely. I need to identify exactly what I need to survive and find the most efficient way to meet those needs. So in this case, let's break down shelter, transportation, food, medical, clothing, and consumables. And step 3, create new solutions from whole cloth in order to meet those needs. So shelter. Well, if I want to try and reduce my expense category in regards to shelter, I could look at something like house hacking. House hacking is the idea of living in a property and renting out other portions of the house. So whether that's literally buying a 5-bedroom house, living in 1 bedroom, renting out the other 4, whether that's buying a 4-plex, living in 1 unit, renting out the other 3, ideally when it comes to shelter, our goal here is going to be able to find a way to be able to live for free in our shelter. So moving on to transportation, again, we can buy really expensive, whatever, 200 Ford F-250 truck that's going to cost us a ton in monthly payments and things of that nature. Oh, it looks like Adam just lost his power. He sent me a text message, but that's all right. We're riding. I know what I'm doing when it comes to financial independence and retiring early. Transportation. We could also, instead of that expensive car and expensive payment, we could literally buy a bike, use public transportation, live close to where we work, and dramatically reduce the amount of money we need to spend in that expense category. Or maybe if you really like the nice vehicle, maybe you can find a way to Uber drive or carpool and have your cost of vehicle subsidized through that means. Now, again, not every solution's equal here. Part of it is determining what your personal priorities are. Then when it comes to food, groceries and growing your own food can be a very cheap solution to reducing your food expenses versus maybe instead having to go out and eat every single day, right? Or go out and eat 3 times a day like some people do, right? Some people literally are going to eat out for every one of their meals. Then when we get into medical costs, well, one, we can be proactive, right? And try and prevent a lot of the costs associated with medical needs. So staying physically fit, trying to consume proper nutrition, taking preventative measures, plus either acquiring insurance or understanding, the climate or the ecosystem that you live in regards to government funded medical solutions, right? So a lot of people here in Canada, they'll be familiar with the idea that a lot of our medical costs are covered for us, but prescription costs aren't necessarily on face value. However, if you're low income, if you're struggling to make expensive medical payments, there are different solutions the government offers. Now, some people might push back and be like, well, hey, aren't you the libertarian anarchist dude? Yes, I am. But understand that the reason I think that it's fine to take advantage, and not take advantage in a negative way, but simply use or utilize the government programs in place, is that's what your tax dollars are supposed to go towards, right? Literally, if I'm paying 50% plus of my income into taxes, and for a lot of Canadians, they are. Maybe not on the surface solely through income taxes, but once you look at consumption taxes, gas taxes, all sorts of different taxes that are layered into the products you buy every single day, you probably are bumping up against 50% or greater of your income going towards taxes. There's nothing wrong with utilizing those programs that those taxes are going to support. Then finally with clothing, literally secondhand clothing, right? Or hand-me-downs. Those are some of the cheapest solutions that you potentially can implement personally in order to be able to really reduce your expense needs or your financial needs in regards to meeting your expenses. Reminder, subscribe to the Substack if you haven't. But I like to view the 3 routes to fire as such. You can literally live for free. So if you're willing to just be that dude that lives out in the woods and builds a cabin out of wood and hunts your own food and all that, you can probably literally live for free in that sense. Or you can become, a ward of the state. You can live off your parents and mooch for free, but none of those are particularly attractive or personally satisfying, in my opinion. However, the 2 other options are, you can either look at accumulating assets, and again, that maybe takes us to saving up 300 times our monthly expenses, or alternatively, we could look towards passive income, right? And there's a lot of different ways you can even break down passive income. But maybe I'll stop here for a second and just give you a chance to jump in here, Adam, and share some of your thoughts when it comes to first principles thinking around financial independence. And where do you think some people maybe stumble when it comes to either identifying and defining their current assumptions, breaking down the problem into its foundational principles, or trying to create new solutions from scratch?
Yeah, that's awesome, Matt. I'm sure you noticed, but my power went out there for a moment, so I dropped off, and so hopefully I respect the audience and don't repeat too much. But I think one of the very interesting things that is dealt with the first principles thinking is just shedding your ego, right? Like, do I actually need these things, or is this truly a luxury that I'm enjoying? And one of the big ego things for me, and one of the things that was probably most game changing in my approach to fire, is the house hacking, right? Like, can you find a way to live for free? And like, you don't even need to own the place, right? You could house hack a rental, so you could rent one room and rent out your other rooms to people, friends, whatever. And yeah, it makes it look like you're living like a student, but guess what's cooler than having your friends make fun of you because you're living with other people? It's not having 30 to 40, 50, 60% of your income going to that shelter cost. And so the first property that I was able to get and then actually house hack, like, that was a game changing experience for me. I mean, that saved me, not only saved, I think it was about $1,800 a month, but I was able to house hack it on Airbnb, which actually allowed me to get a surplus out of my house, right? So my house was paying me to live in it, all the while I was paying down my my debt on the property through principal pay down. So that was like game changing to me. Now, where I struggle is in some of the other things that I enjoy. And I think, Matt, if you didn't mention it, I think there is a worthwhile point or discussion here to be had about conscious consumption, where there's certain things that you might just literally value. Okay. And for me, unfortunately, those things are expensive. Okay. I love cars. I actually love them. And so I've always wanted to have a nice car, not because of the outward ego, but because of my experience that I have with them. Now, in saying that, I also know that if I'm conscious about this thing, I can turn it off, right? And so at any given point, I'm happy to actually sell my nice cars. I'm happy to sell my motorcycle or my Tesla or my truck at any given point, knowing full well that if it's not suiting my current financial position, then it's not worth it, right? Then all of a sudden it is more of a vanity thing or whatever. And but I enjoy them. And so when I do have the income, I like to enjoy some of those things. But I do think that if your ego is in the way, you are definitely going to find yourself in a bad position where maybe it's like only cool to eat at certain restaurants or be members of certain clubs or to wear certain clothing or certain brands, right, of clothing. And I think when you find yourself in that trap, unless you honestly, first principles, have the income to support that type of thing, and you've got that savings rate, or you've got that 300, sorry, was it 600x? 600x,
300
right?
times. Yeah.
Oh, 300 times, because you want the 4% rule. And you guys got to look at that study. But if you're not there, and you got to be so honest with yourself, if you're not there, you have to abstain from those things because they're not necessary. They really aren't. And so I think that those are some of the places where people really mistake themselves. It's like, oh, I have to have the nice house. I have to have the nice car. I need to be wearing the cool clothes. And, unless those things are honestly going to be so conscious, like, you got to stay away from those until you have all the money. So,
yeah, I think that's a good point there, Adam. And again, just to build upon it, from like a first principles thinking, we don't necessarily have to sacrifice everything that you want. We just need to find new innovative approaches to it, right? So, like,
yes.
let's say you really consider yourself like a gearhead or you love cars. Well, there's a lot of different ways you could likely scratch that itch. One, you could go out and buy a brand new Porsche or Lamborghini or Ferrari or whatever. Or maybe you could get into restoring old cars, right? And that could actually become a way that you can own a bunch of different cars, but you're buying them cheap. You're putting in the love and labor necessary to fix them up to their highest, best, most efficient use. Very similar to what I did with real estate, right? And then turn around and sell it. And this could be a way that you could constantly have new cars coming into your life. You get to know those cars way more than the dude that simply walks into the Ferrari dealership and slaps down 100 or 200K in order to buy that car. And you're still scratching a very similar itch. And I would argue you're learning practical skills as well. So you're literally leveling yourself up versus the person that's like, oh, I just take it to the dealership and write $1,000 immediately the moment it needs an oil change or a wheel or a tire changed, right? Because I know nothing about vehicles. Like that's another very easy way to approach it. Or let's say you want to live in a very high-end, prestigious neighborhood for whatever reason. Maybe you want to live next to your in-laws. Maybe you want to live in the best school district possible. And the only way to do so is to live in a very expensive home. Well, does that home have like a guest suite? Could you rent out the guest suite in order to subsidize that cost? Or better yet, would you be willing to live in the guest suite for a period of time while renting out the primary portion of the home? Still, you're able to meet and satisfy that need, but we're just thinking outside of the box, right? When it comes to first principles thinking. And that's what's so clutch, in my opinion, about this.
I think, Matt, one of the things that you just brought up that I think is really quite beautiful about first principles thinking is it allows us the freedom of thinking about how we can turn some of these liabilities into actual assets in our life, right? And I think your example with the car is brilliant because we've even experienced too, like our friend Mike built a beautiful YouTube channel that pays very handsomely because he's so passionate about it, right? And I think when we take the first principles approach and we're looking at something that is traditionally a liability and we're passionate about that thing, it's very easy for us to imagine, well, maybe it's not easy, but it's simple to imagine a bunch of different ways where we could turn that into an asset. And, you know, even things like as basic as Uber, honestly, like if you want to drive a cool car, like why not just have it pay for itself while you get to drive it? Or there's like Turo where other people get to drive it and it pays for your stuff, right? And like, you know, when I think about things like cars or even your house, like you're just honestly not there most of the time, right? You're not driving your car most of the time. In fact, most of the time it sits there while you're at work. And the same thing with your house. Like your primary residence, unless you're going to be improving it and selling it tax-free, is just a big liability if you're not making any revenue off of it. So I love first principles thinking for that reason. It's like, how can we turn our expenses into revenue sources? And that's a really cool way to very quickly take down a lot of the cost that adds to sort of that golden handcuff moment where you're just running on a hamster wheel to keep up with your monthlies.
Yeah, 100% agree. And originally, I was thrown off when you said our buddy Mike, but I realized you meant Mike Van Hout and not Mike Rosehart. And so, specifically to what Mike Van Hout is doing, he literally has created a YouTube channel where he's constantly reviewing brand new high end luxury vehicles. He also does like non luxury vehicles, but I imagine a lot of people that aspire to live the lifestyle Mike does wants to get in those brand new luxury vehicles. Well, because of that, not only has he found a way to subsidize his car habit by simply getting paid, ad revenue off of YouTube, but he's now able to like get into cars before the public can because he's built up such a large following based upon that passion. One thing that Adam and I currently are dabbling with is NFTs and NFT culture. Well, again, a really simple way to go from having to pay thousands of dollars to attend NFT events is either to become the host of those NFT events and start hosting the parties yourself, or alternatively, become an influencer in that space that gets invited, where literally your public perception is such that people want you to attend, and so they're willing to comp you or even pay for your travel. There's a lot of different ways that a person can approach solving these different problems. But again, if you're only thinking the traditional route, if you're only thinking the way everyone else thinks, you're never going to break out of that box. And your only tool is going to be money. And your only way to get that tool is going to be by working harder and working longer. Again, there's nothing wrong with having a strong work ethic. In fact, I think that's something to be very proud of. However, I do think there's something wrong to being a wage slave, to literally living a life where you don't feel like you're in control. If you want to work until you're 99, I have no beef with that whatsoever. In fact, I strongly encourage that. And I think that lots of people will live the most fulfilling life by creating value for others. And there's a lot of different ways to go about creating that value. However, if you feel like you have to work until you're 99, that feels like the darkest route possible. That feels like the darkest timeline, in my opinion. That's filled with despair and lack of hope. And so again, I just want to stress so much, regardless of where you're at right now, there's probably a way you can flip one of your biggest expense categories into a net positive, right? An example that was regularly used in the early retirement extreme forums was, if you love playing soccer or hockey or whatever, why not become a ref or an official? those people get paid to participate in the sport. Now, again, it's going to be different than actually literally getting to kick the ball or shoot the puck, but it's still a way to expose yourself to that ecosystem and either subsidize or get paid in order to participate in that ecosystem. There's just, with the advent of where technology is these days, with social media being what it is, there is no excuse. You can literally turn any hobby into a net revenue generating perspective. Again, maybe you love expensive nerd hobbies like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon cards or whatever. Well, you could literally just shell out thousands of dollars to get those expensive cards, or you could create content around it. And while not everyone's going to be able to make thousands of dollars around their content, those that are truly passionate will not only be able to scratch that itch, but put themselves in a better financial position for having thought outside the box.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, you've even like turned my attention over to some YouTube channels where it's like these guys are just, they love garage sailing, right? And so they'll go around and like big guys, like even Gary Vaynerchuk. I mean, he's in a position where, you know, driving around on a Sunday morning to attend a garage sale maybe doesn't make a lot of financial sense, but then all of a sudden he turns around and makes content out of it that makes that hobby or that activity make a lot of sense for him, and adds value to his viewers and things like that. And I guess, like, you know, content generation is not going to be for everybody, but the point here is that you can turn these things into a potential asset for you. And I think one of the reasons why that's so important is I find a lot of people, they get sucked into jobs or lifestyles and career paths that don't necessarily scratch their itches at all. It's like they're just doing it for the money. But I think many studies have shown that like money is not a great motivator. And in fact, that's probably a really dark path to go down because it's not going to lead to fulfillment or transcendence, right? You already brought up Maslow. And then one of the other comments I want to make is like, if you have to work until 65 or 95, right? Like you're saying, oftentimes you're also the victim of these externalities, right? Like when I think about what's going on right now in Europe with gas prices, with heating expenses, with inflation, what's going on in North America with inflation and these taxes and raising costs of literally everything that contribute to your cost of living. It's like, man, you got to be prepared for that. And you hopefully are prepared to weather those storms doing the things that you love. And not having to sacrifice on other things like time with family and time with friends and doing those hobbies that you enjoy with your spare time. It's like, if you can get control over that, then when these storms come up, it's like, oh no, I've got to do more of my hobby. That's a revenue source. Like, you know, that's awful. And it just gives you that security and freedom to be able to take your time back, which is so, that to me is the root of all of this. Right? Time is literally the only non-renewable resource. And why would we not make serious and concerted efforts to attempt to gain control over that time? And I guess one thing too, and Matt, I'm not sure if this was something that you had planned on talking about, but you know, I think it's really important to expose those around you and especially including those people in your family unit to these concepts as well. Because like if you're trying to wage this battle for financial independence and then there's people in your lives fighting against that, it's going to make it a lot harder. So, you know, I guess, have you noticed that as well, Matt? And I did see that we had a comment before in our chat that said like divorce is not great for fire. And I think that's probably a valid point. But I think that like communicating this to other people is almost as important as some of the acts that you do to get there.
Yeah, certainly. If you've got people in your life that are supporters of your vision of reaching financial independence, it will be far easier to achieve that. You know, I'm a huge fan of the concept, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So if the 5 people you spend the most time with around you believe in your vision, it will be a lot easier moving forward and being able to succeed at that. At the same time, I think you can do it alone, right? Like, I don't think that you have to have buy-in from the people around you. But if you're not going to have their buy-in, you need to be fully committed, right? Because there will be friction, there will be doubters, and that friction and those doubters may be well-intentioned, right? They may have only have the best intentions for you and your future, but they don't understand the level of buy-in and thoughtfulness that you've necessarily applied to the subject matter. And one other thing I just want to circle back to, Adam, that you were kind of hitting upon, is for a lot of people, they have very few degrees of freedom, as in the only way they can solve a problem is with money. And so if that's the only way you can solve that problem, you're always going to have to turn towards that. And that's going to mean that money becomes a huge stressor in your life. Whereas if you start to expand your horizons and think outside the box, you start to realize there's a lot of different ways that you could, achieve what you're trying to accomplish. Far too often we think that it has to be, the for the average person that wants to start a family, they think it needs to be the house in suburbia with the white picket fence, the brand new minivan, the 2.5 kids, the dog, the whole shebang. And yet, at the same time, you can probably find a similar or better quality of life by thinking outside that box, right? By finding different solutions available. And again, if the only tool you believe you've got in your tool belt or in your chest is money, that's the only lens through which you're going to view every one of these problems. And I think that that's a big struggle for a lot of people when they first start to expose themselves to the idea of financial independence. Again, I think for the average person, it takes a while to acclimate to this concept, right? So I'm not expecting that this is literally the first time you've ever heard of FIRE, that you're going to be able to switch everything in your life tomorrow. There maybe are exceptional individuals out there capable of that, but for the vast majority of people, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be a very slow process towards that. But what you want to do is start today, right? Like start acclimating yourself, start exposing yourself to these different thoughts and ideas. Because once you start to really think creatively, you realize that there's very few obstacles in your life that are truly dead ends. It may just involve a pivot or a slight, trajectory change. I want to jump into a couple other points, though, in the Substack article. When we're talking about passive income, I think it's worth exploring that there's different means to passive income as well. So for the purpose of the guide that I'm sharing with you guys, we identified 4 streams of potential passive income. Intellectual property. So that could be things like content creation. It could be patents, things along those lines. Businesses, right? So again, whether that's the laundromat that you're making passive income from, there's a lot of different solutions. Real estate, as well as debt or public equities, right? And those are more... think of those as like paper assets. So when we're looking at these 4 different categories, the real key here, if you want to really reach the full potential of FIRE, in my opinion, is finding ways to reduce the needed amount of time and energy on your end to manage these. So intellectual property, maybe it's you partner or invest with someone into a piece of content, into writing a book, whatever the case is. There's ways that you can essentially not have to be involved in the day-to-day production of that asset category. Or for businesses, right? If you've got a manager or CEO in place of the business you own, again, that's an easy way to remove your time constraints there. And that's where I think you start to get to be financially independent. Same with real estate investing, right? If you're having to answer the phone for every one of the emergencies that come up at your property, maybe you aren't truly retired, maybe you're not truly financially independent, but you're probably on the path there. And at some point in time, you'll either scale your portfolio or change the operations of your real estate holdings or your businesses for that matter, to the point where you're more managing managers rather than necessarily having to be boots on the ground deep in the trenches. And then debt or public equities, those are already pretty passive. But again, things like index funds can even, make it more of an abstraction where you're really not that involved in day-to-day operations of managing your paper portfolio. One other point I wanted to explore with you guys is that FIRE comes in many different flavors and sizes. So in my opinion, there's not a one size fits all. But for the average person, I think it's a gradual process. And lean FIRE is likely the first goal you're going to aim for. So lean FIRE is aiming to achieve a lower level of consumption, spending significantly less than the average citizen. This may be accomplished by needing less or focused on resourceful solutions or substitutions. Often associated with minimalism, stoicism, frugality, and anti-consumerism. Then there's mainstream FIRE, which is FIRE aiming to achieve similar standard of living as the average citizen. Their consumption patterns may vary from the average citizen, but their lifestyle and standard of living is very similar. So again, there's lots of ways that you essentially can live like the Joneses without necessarily having to foot the same bill or the same cost that the Joneses do in regards to their standard of living. Then there's fat FIRE. So this is aiming to achieve a higher standard of living than the average citizen. Oftentimes, this can be accomplished through growing the gap between expenses and income by focusing on the income side of the equation. So most often for someone beginning day one with financial independence and retiring early, it probably makes sense to first focus on your expense categories and try and reduce those as much as possible. But as you mature and get more experience in that space, you kind of transition into focusing on growing the income if you really want to achieve that level of fat FIRE. I'm not going to go deep into the 4 4% rule, but Adam already referenced it on the show, and it's worth sinking your teeth into if you guys are interested. And again, you can grab it from the Substack article or get the free guide on my website. But when we're playing with some of the tools that are listed here, Fire Calc is one where what you can do is essentially explore with that 4% safe withdrawal rate what level of assets you would need in order to essentially just buy a mix of bonds and equities or like build out that paper portfolio of assets. So $500,000 would produce $20,000 in annual spending with a 20 or with a 4% safe withdrawal rate. So $500,000 maybe sounds intimidating in the moment, but understand that there's lots of ways that you can go about building out that capital base. Real estate investing was my preferred mechanism. But again, if you join like early retirement extreme forums or the Mr. Money Mustache forums, you'll find people of all different colors, stripes, and approaches that were able to succeed with reaching their financial independence and retire early goals through a variety of means. And so again, always be focused on that first principles thinking. In fact, first principles thinking doesn't only apply to financial independence. We really should be taking this to almost every aspect of our life, because if you're only doing what the majority does, you're only going to get what the majority gets. And I think that living an average life is almost a life wasted to a certain extent, because you're probably capable of so much more. You probably have, greater ambitions inside you, even if you don't realize it today. But oftentimes people tamper down their expectations. They tamper down their self-belief because they've just never spent the time to invest into even thinking about these things, into exploring their existing problems through first principles thinking. Anything you wanted to add to that, Adam?
Yeah, I would just add that, like, I think fire is one of those ever-changing things. Like, I think fire, and perhaps even using actual fire as the analogy, is very dynamic, right? There's times in which you may want to expand your lifestyle, and there's times in which you may need to contract it. And I think that a large part of being able to accept this is like understanding where real safety is, and that's perhaps the lean fire, right? And then being able to, again, with that conscious consumption, allow yourself to explore other avenues as well. And so, like, even right now, I'm going through a contraction, right? So my business has been hit just like everybody else's during the last, 6 months or so, 12 months maybe, as we see this sort of this huge economic contraction and the rise of cost of living from everybody. Like, it's going to affect everybody. And so as my business contracts, I need to make those conscious decisions to also contract my lifestyle. And I think that that's a very important thing to understand, is like at various points in your journey with fire, you'll just have different needs and you'll have different wants and you'll have different expectations. And all of this comes down to really just managing your ego and being honest with yourself about where you're truly at. Like, if you have less income today because whatever, maybe the markets are not doing well, or maybe real estate's down, or maybe your IP isn't generating what you need it to do. These things happen, right? And I think the key is to make sure that you have a realistic baseline for yourself, and then understanding where you are in relation to that baseline in terms of your multiple streams of income. And then just being honest with yourself when you're in a point of contraction. And I think that that's normal, right? Like, if your goals change, if you have different ideas of what would be great for an above average life for yourself, which everybody I hope is striving for. Again, like Matt said, an average life kind of sucks. Like, why would you want to be average? So, if you're aiming for fat fire, but then you lose certain income streams, or those income streams contract, it's sensible that you need to really think, okay, maybe I need to be aiming down at a lower peg. And that's not a loss, right? That's not actually a loss. That's reality, right? And this is perhaps, to make this a little more sensible, there's a good health analogy, right? And health comparison. Your health and wellness, your body fat essentially comes down to calories in and calories out, right? And if you have a surplus of calories, you're going to be getting fat. If you have a loss of calories or a calorie deficit, you're going to lose that fat, because your body's just going to keep on burning whatever it burns based on your activity levels. That's the same as this. And I think the idea here is, if you are gaining too much body fat, you just have to recognize that you need to trim it, right? You need to have a calorie deficit in order to get rid of that. And that's perfectly fine. And so if, for example, you make you have a goal that you want that six pack, and you make a mistake, and you have a crazy weekend out, and you have a bunch of pizza and hamburgers and fries, and you start gaining fat. It's like, well, the next thing to do is not give up on your goal. It's actually to just have a great week after that, or a great day. And I think that's maybe one of the misunderstandings when it comes to finances, is because we're so socially conditioned not to talk about money, that we don't understand that it's so similar to these other things in life. Like, you don't just give up on your goal after a bad weekend of eating, right? You just make the next day better. And I think the smaller we can have our little periods of measurement, like if you have a bad day where, say you, whatever, for whatever reason, you like bought too many meals out that week, like, well, just make next week better, or the next day, or the next hour. Like, you don't need to continue in a negative spiral because you've made a few bad decisions. It's like, no, let's just start making good, positive decisions right now, starting this second, this minute, this day, this week, this month, this year, and be able to move forward. And I think that's the key to all of this. It's like, make bad decisions, because you will, right? And then immediately recognize that this is probably not helping you, and it's taking you off of the path to your goal. Right? If there's a straight line from you and your goal, whatever you're doing that's a negative behavior is just taking you off that path and adding time. So if we think about it in the concept of time, which we can't get refunded, it's like, how many of these bad decisions do I really want to make because I believe I'm in a negative spiral? No, just start making better decisions right now. And that will shorten the path from where you are to where you need to be.
I think one of the biggest secrets to life is just understanding that anything and everything is almost an iterative process. If you can embrace that and focus on improving the iterations, and ideally increasing the frequency of those iterations, you'll be a lot better for it. But to kind of wrap up and yet build upon what you were saying, Adam, I just want to remind everyone where we started off, right? So when thinking about first principles thinking, identify and define your current assumptions. So maybe you assume right now that you have to have that $2,000 or $3,000 a month mortgage payment, or that $1,000 vehicle payment. Well, let's really question that and break down the problem in step two into its foundational principles. Well, I don't actually need that $1,000 a month car payment. What I need is a transportation solution. And it turns out there's a lot of different ways that I can probably achieve my transportation needs other than simply through that $1,000 a month vehicle payment. And then finally, create new solutions from scratch based upon exploring step one and step two. That really is the key to everything I wanted to explore with you guys in today's video around financial independence and retiring early. I absolutely believe anyone can do this, but I think very few people will do it by accident. So it is going to have to be, a active decision you make, like Adam was saying, almost daily, that I want to improve where I am at in my financial lives. If right now you guys feel completely lost, step one, just look at what you're spending. Let's just get a real understanding of what I'm spending on a monthly basis, or what my yearly expenses look like. Based upon that, we can start to then dive deeper into really identifying and defining our current assumptions around that, right? And we can break down the problem into the different parts and components of it in order to really explore it through those fundamental principles. And then finally, we can look at creating new solutions from scratch. So yeah, that's it really when it comes to financial independence, retiring early, and talking about first principles. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with Adam and I on this Monday episode. I hope you got value from it. If you did, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new to the channel. Make sure you've joined our Telegram chat as well as signed up on Substack. All this stuff is free. We're just focused on trying to have our best day ever, and we hope to help facilitate that for you guys as well.
Yeah, excellent, Matt. Thank you. And I'll leave you with one last tactical tip for getting to fire. Print out your bank statements, print out your credit card statements. You may be surprised. You may be actually very surprised to find what categories you're spending your money in. So be honest with yourself, and the numbers don't lie. And luckily with financial independence, it's all zeros and ones. So we'll see you guys back here tomorrow. Actually, programming is TBD for tomorrow. So while I'd love to give you an announcement on what that's going to be, we still got to work on that. So that's what you get for being away for a week, you guys. But it's so good to be back, and we will see you tomorrow. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.